Welcome to Beyond Sunday School. We are glad to have you with us this week as we continue our season here on the resurrection. And we've looked at kind of the secular views of resurrection and life after death from around the first century. We've looked at Jewish perspectives on life after death around the time of Christ. We've done a pretty deep dive into Paul's theology on resurrection, and now we are going to spend probably 2 weeks here on the Gospels look at resurrection before, and that will bring us to the end of this season of Beyond Sunday School. We'll take a few weeks off, get reloaded, and then we're gonna spend some time looking at the Gospels, and kind of taking a look at what's going on in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So that's where we'll head for our next season. But we are glad that you are with us this week. As always, we record live Thursday mornings at 10 a.m., and you are welcome to join us for the live recording. Wherever you see this, watch this, hear this, just let me know, reach out to me and let me know that you want to be a part of the live recording, and I'll make sure you get a link to our conversation. And so you can also just learn some new things about our new platform that we're using, the Melon app. So to that end, you can subscribe to my regular devotionals, danielemrose.com, for free, and love to have you there, and you can catch some of that stuff in your inbox. So back to Beyond Sunday School. What we are using a fantastic New Testament theology called The New Testament in Its World: An Introduction to the History, Literature, and Theology of the First Christians by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. So that's so if you want to grab a nice big book that will look super impressive on your bookshelf, go ahead and grab this one, and you can follow along with us. We would love for you to do that as well. So as for those of you watching live on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, wherever you may be catching this, you should be able to leave a comment and ask questions as we go along. We'd love to have that. And so again, if you hear some voices in the background throughout our time together, those are the folks that are part of the room and are part of the live recording. So on to the show, right? This week, we are beginning this conversation about the resurrection in the Gospels. And so there's one, before we kind of dive into the Gospels in particular, what we want to do is I want to take a little bit of time and walk through some of these some of the presuppositions that we have regarding the Easter narratives in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And we want to, because we want to have some sense of where we're coming from, right? Like that's as we work our way through trying to do things in a bit of a historical way. We have to state our presuppositions. We kind of have to look at, where are we coming from? What are our jumping off points? How are we looking at, thinking about the text of the Gospels? So we're going to look at 8 ideas that shape our understanding of the New Testament, of the Gospels. So let's get rolling here. Again, we are basing this off of The New Testament in Its World by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. And so step one, as we look at this, the stories lack scriptural embellishment. All right, so as we look at the gospel stories, we notice that they lack something that we might expect, and that is what Wright and Bird refer to as scriptural embellishment. So what does that mean? What does a lack of scriptural embellishment mean? Well, what it means is we would expect to see the gospel writers quoting the Old Testament when it comes to these questions and issues of resurrection. We would expect as these guys were putting together the gospel accounts that they would show how the idea of resurrection came about, how the idea of a resurrected Messiah came about from the Old Testament, if they were trying to explain the resurrection of Jesus or the empty tomb from the place of kind of starting at a theological place, right? But they don't. We don't see that. What we see are Easter narratives that are scripturally unadorned, as Wright and Bird put it. We don't see a whole bunch of quotes from the Old Testament. Like we would expect to possibly see Hosea 6:2 or Daniel 12:2. These are verses that we explored a few weeks ago as we looked at kind of the Jewish ideas of resurrection and life after the dead, and from those verses you could build the story, but they don't. They simply start with this statement of an empty tomb and in these appearances by Jesus, and they just state them that this is what happened. So it's interesting, to say the least. And really what this probably points to, or what we're going to argue that this points to, is that Jesus' burial did happen, that Jesus' empty tomb did happen, and that Jesus did rise from the dead, that the resurrection did happen. And that it wasn't some theological construct. It wasn't something that was written back into the story later. It was it was what they experienced. It is what they saw, and that is why they wrote down what they wrote down and how they wrote down what they wrote down. So that's step number one. Now, step number two. The burial of Jesus and the discovery of the empty tomb can be regarded as historically solid. So we are going to build this statement off a couple of things. First, we want to acknowledge the reality that Jesus was taken off the cross. Now, a lot of times when people were crucified, they were just left on the cross to be eaten by birds and other animals. That was just kind of how the Romans rolled. They were not exactly nice guys. But Roman officials were oftentimes known to allow people to be taken down off the cross, off of crosses, especially during times of festivals. And it was also likely that the Romans, being the pluralists that they were, or at least utilitarian pluralists, what I mean by that is they wanted to kind of keep the peace at any cost. And so as a result of that, they probably were very cognizant of Jewish customs. And so what we find in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 through 23, is a command that people who were hung should not be left out after sunset. And so the Romans, knowing this rule, probably were good with the Jewish people taking down their crucifixion victims to be properly buried in accordance with Jewish custom, because that would help them keep the peace. And keeping the peace for the Romans was paramount. Another thing that we think of as we look at kind of the historical reality of Jesus's burial is that in the early Christian church, the early kind of Christian tradition, the Jewish people were oftentimes mostly blamed for what happened to Jesus. So probably around the time that the Gospels were being pieced together and put together and written down and published, there was probably already this growing kind of anti-Jewish sentiment among some of the early church. And when I say anti-Jewish, I don't mean like the people in general, but kind of the religious leaders in particular, the Jewish power structure, because the early church was primarily Jewish for a while. So there was this blame of the early Jewish leadership structure that you would think would find its way into the gospel story regarding the burial of Jesus. And yet, what are we told? Who are we told is the one that buries Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, a member of the religious leadership institution, right? I mean, it seems odd that if at the time the Gospels were being written down, that this man would have been highlighted as somebody who buried Jesus. And it seems like that kind of would have been scrubbed from the record based on what we know about the kind of sentiment that existed at the time of the Gospels being written. And yet, here he is. He is the one that Jesus is handed over to, and he is the one that provides burial for him. What we would have probably expected was potentially a no-named faithful disciple being the one to do that work. But as a religious leader, which points again towards the historicity, the historical validity of these burial stories. The second, and then kind of the big thing on this one is Mark. Is the way that Mark lays this whole thing out in his gospel. So let's take a look here at Mark 16, 1 through 8. It says, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, the tomb. But young man dressed in a robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who is crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So, what do we have? What is going on in this passage that leads us to kind of embracing some of this historical reality of the gospel narratives? Well, first, in verse 1, it says, when the Sabbath was over. Right, so Jesus was taken down off the cross, and then was laid to rest. But they couldn't go do the work to prepare him because it was Sabbath. And we know from the Ten Commandments that they were not going to work on the Sabbath, and so they were obeying. They were in obedience to the Sabbath, and they were that fits very well with a historical reality. The next thing is verse 3, this question of rolling the stone away from the entrance of the tomb. We know from plenty of other sources that this is often the way that tombs were sealed up, that this was nothing unusual. For there to be a large stone in front of the tomb would have been expected, normal, standard practice. This is not unusual. This is just a normal thing, and we see them. There's still evidence of that today. In verse 5, the angel is depicted as a young man, and this fits very well with first century Jewish writings and the way that angels were often depicted in first century Jewish writings. So this also seems to fit well with the expectations one would have from a Jewish perspective in the first century. And verse 6, Jesus is referred to as the Nazarene. Again, this really shows us some of the kind of Palestinian ambience, as Wright and Bird put it, to what was going on here in the telling of this story. So, remember the story of Peter, denying Jesus. Jesus is referred to as the Galilean, and in other places he's referred to as the Nazarene. This fits very, very well with, again, what we would expect. If this were something added later, if this was something that was more clarified or more theologically driven, we would probably expect the angel to say, "You are looking for Jesus the Messiah." And yet what we get here is Jesus the Nazarene, which just seems most simply to point to an early oral tradition that is seeking to be historically accurate. In verse 7, we get the reference to the Galilee, again, hitting home on this very localized understanding of what was going on, and pointing back to the reality that this is what you would expect from people trying to tell the story as is, because the Galilee really wasn't all that interesting of a place, and yet here it is named, and it is focused, and it is specific. So, and then you get this language of resurrection in verse 6, which makes sense. Again, the he has risen, he is not here. So this is important to also see that this language, this idea of Jesus not being a ghost, not being an apparition, that he was, this statement of he has risen, he is not here, points to a physical resurrection. The body is gone. This is not necessarily the way you would expect early Jewish, the first century Jews to necessarily talk about what had happened, especially if they were trying to read back into it some theological construct from Daniel or Ezekiel. We see here this resurrection language, which is very important to note. So, if as Wright and Bird put it, had the tomb not been empty, that entire wrinkle in the story would be inexplicable. So, if Jesus was still there and the angel said he's not here, that would have been odd, right? Would have been inexplicable. So, next thing we want to look at here is the Eastern narratives seem to reflect a mixture of eyewitness enthusiasm and strange bewilderment as to what had actually happened. The Eastern narratives seem to reflect a mixture of eyewitness enthusiasm and strange bewilderment as to what had actually happened. So what are we saying? What are we trying to communicate with that? Well, quite simply, what we're trying to get at is that the responses of the eyewitnesses in the Eastern narratives are what you would expect eyewitness responses to be. they were not just kind of standard woohoo, Jesus is raised, praise God, like let's go. Like that wasn't the response. The response was excitement, to be sure, on some level, but also just this kind of like, whoa, strange things are afoot at the tomb. Like, what is going on here? This doesn't make sense. And we see that. No, we see that even in what we just looked at in Mark 16, right? Verse 8, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. There was this, they had all the emotions, right? I mean, isn't that what you would expect? If you showed up at a tomb expecting to prepare somebody for burial, but what you found instead was an angel sitting there telling you that the tomb, that Jesus had risen and that the tomb was empty, you'd feel all of that, right? You would feel the trembling, I mean, that idea of trembling is kind of this excitement thing, but this bewilderment, this fear too. All of the feelings would have hit you, and it's just wild. They saw Jesus die. They watched as Jesus's body was put into the tomb. You know, sometimes I think we assume that people back in the day, the ancients, were dumb. They knew what a dead body was. They knew when somebody was dead. Jesus was dead. They saw him get buried. They showed up at the tomb. They had seen the tomb closed, but they showed up and the tomb was empty. It made no sense. It was shocking. It was bewildering. It was fear-inducing. All of these emotions were exactly what you would expect from the eyewitnesses. It's also interesting that as you read through these stories, and some people, as they read through the gospel narratives about the resurrection, say, well, the gospel writers have a problem here because the lists of women were different, right? This is definitely a conflict. This is definitely an issue that we have to deal with. Well, I think what's interesting is Richard Bauckham wrote a kind of the seminal work on the eyewitnesses of Jesus. Great book. I highly recommend it. Excellent scholarly work on the eyewitness testimony of Jesus. Worth the book. But in it, he says the divergences, that is the difference of the lists, right? So which women were there? Was it Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, Joanna? There's these different lists that kind of pop up. And he says the divergences have often been taken as grounds for not taking them seriously as naming eyewitnesses of the events. In fact, the opposite is the case. The divergences, properly understood, demonstrate the scrupulous care with which the Gospels present the women as witnesses. And what that means is that as the Gospel writers were doing their work, as they were pursuing the testimony, as they were trying to research this, and the different, as they're moving in their own different communities. They discovered, here was this woman that we know was there, or this woman that we know was there, and then there's this also, and so they were putting in the work, piecing it together. So some of this just gets clarified, and so it makes sense. Now, it's also important to point out that it is surprising, to say the least, that we have women as the initial eyewitnesses of Jesus's resurrection and empty tomb. At this point in time, women had no legal standing. They could not be called as witnesses. Josephus, he puts it this way, as the way that Deuteronomy 19:15 was applied in law at the time. He says, "From women, let no evidence be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their sex." So it turned, misogyny was full and long and strong going back then, and so it's interesting that the Gospels all include these lists of women. What gets more interesting is when you come to realize that the Gospels were written and circulated after Paul, right? So Paul's letters are the first written down things that we have in the New Testament. They're the earliest writings we have. And then the Gospels came. And I don't know if you guys remember last week. I don't know if you remember, well, it was 2 weeks ago now, right? I don't know if you remember our discussion on 1 Corinthians 15. Were there any women listed in 1 Corinthians 15? Nope. They were airbrushed. They were airbrushed out. Paul, citing probably an early creedal statement, leaves out the women. So by the time Paul is writing, the women have been airbrushed out of the creedal statement, have been brushed out of these confessional statements that people were making regarding the resurrection. Why? Well, because it probably, it fits better. It fits the culture better. It was easier to communicate. It's just a bunch of dudes and eyewitnesses. So you would think that the Gospels, being written down and circulated after Paul, would have completely erased the women. Why didn't they? Well, because the women were the first ones there. The women were the initial eyewitnesses. The women were probably still alive. There were people in that first generation who knew that the women were the ones that were the original eyewitnesses. And if you were going to write down a story about what happened in the resurrection of Christ, and you just erased them from the story, there would have been people who said, yeah, but hey, wait, what about Mary? What about Joanna? What about Salome? What about the other Mary? They were the ones that saw this, not Peter, not John. What's going on here? Somebody probably would have had that conversation. And so the gospel writers included these stories, which would have not been, that was not a good political move. This does not add in the first century to their credibility, to the general world. But now as we look back on it, it adds a lot of credibility because it didn't make sense to include these women. And so it is fascinating. It really is fascinating to think that here's the creedal statement, the confessional statement in 1 Corinthians 15, no mention of women, which comes before the Gospels. And now here are the Gospels, and they give you the full inclusion of the women in this. Very, very important. Very important statement to the historicity of our gospel stories and the eyewitness accounts. Fourth, The wide breadth of people who saw Jesus is also telling. And so we kind of looked at that in detail last week. So you have this, you have Jesus showing up in all kinds of places, right? He shows up to Simon Peter. He shows up, to the disciples walking to Emmaus. He shows up in the upper room. He even shows up. He shows up to a bunch of people on a beach. He shows up to more than 500. So there is this, and in all of that, what we see is this again. These multiple feelings of confusion and joy and happiness, and so. Reitenberg put it this way, and I think it's a good summary point. He said they just say, looking at the appearances as a whole, the very strong historical probability is that when Matthew, Luke, and John describe the risen Jesus, they are writing down very early oral tradition, representing three different ways in which the original astonished participants told the stories. That is just the simplest way of understanding what we see in Matthew, Luke, in John in the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. So now we have, and you can go back and look at more of that in our last week's episode, looking at 1 Corinthians 15. So number 5, we have to wrestle with the question of why the early Christians said Jesus is risen if all they had intended to describe was a hallucination, a vision, or a vague belief that Jesus had ascended post-mortem into some heavenly, otherworldly realm, right? So why did they say Jesus is risen if they didn't mean Jesus is risen? Because remember what we talked about way back in the Jewish conversation of the afterlife. The idea of a risen Jesus is a very specific, resurrection was a very specific idea. Rising from the dead was a very specific idea. And so again, why didn't they say, as Reitenberg put it, why didn't they say, I have a warm feeling in my heart that our dear friend Yeshua ben Yosef is now safely arrived in the bosom of Abraham? Why didn't they say that? Why didn't they say, he came, we're hallucinating this. Why did they talk about a body coming back to life? Because remember, that's what resurrection literally means, is the standing up of a dead corpse. And so, what is going on here? Now, we do know, again, from our conversations about the Jewish understanding of life after death, the Jewish understanding of resurrection, that there was an expectation of resurrection that was going to happen at the consummation of history, right? This is kind of what we began to see developed out of Ezekiel, out of Elijah, out of Daniel, these writings. And this is what shaped Jewish thought at the time. And yet, what do we see happen with Jesus? We see a resurrection that took place in the middle of history. Right? History had not been culminated yet. So what was going on? How did that happen? What was happening here? And so it forced these early Christians to readjust their understanding of history, of how all of this was being played out, and they had to make some adjustments, because the thing that God had promised was happening in the present. It wasn't just going to be something that was happening in the future, but it had now already happened. And so they they had to make some tweaks, and they understood Jesus as physically rising from the dead. Next, we're almost there. 6, a further sign that the Easter stories in the 4 Gospels go back to very early pre-Pauline tradition is the remarkable absence in them of any mention of the Christian future hope. So let's think about that. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean by that, quite simply, is that remember with Paul, what we see over and over and over again is him tying the resurrection to our future hope, to our future hope of resurrection, for the resurrection of the whole of the people of God, the consummation of history, right? The reconciliation of all things, the new heavens, the new earth, this new creation that was coming as a result of life coming through the one man, the Christ. And so if, again, acknowledging the reality that the Gospels came after Pauline, after the Pauline letters, we would expect there to be this pointing towards, or this connection to, a future hope in the discussion and the storytelling of the resurrection of Christ. And yet that is absent. We don't see that. Why? Surely the gospel writers knew what Paul had written. We know for sure Luke would have known. Mark would have known. Mark and Luke both traveled with Paul. Surely they knew. Paul's letters were widely being distributed, widely being circulated. So why no connection? Why no statement of the future Christian hope? Again, the simplest reason for that is that the gospel writers were going back to the earliest oral tradition about what took place at the resurrection of Christ, trying to tell that story. And so in some sense, you could say that the Gospels are the Easter narratives in the Gospels are de-theologized. They're trying to just tell the story. And so that again brings us back to this kind of historicity thing. These weren't necessarily just told with the hope of advancing some theological construct. They were telling the story, an earlier story, that early oral tradition that Paul built off of, and that they too were now building off of, but they were just trying to relate that story. So, number 7. Another similar point concerns the portrait of Jesus in the stories. All right. So what do we make of that? Well, this idea of the portrait of Jesus in the stories, again, kind of goes back to this whole thing about theologizing the stories, rooting them in the Old Testament, right? So I really like the way that Wright and Bird put this. They say, if as many have suggested, the Easter stories were invented by people who knew their scriptures and the Jewish traditions which developed them, the two models that might have influenced the writing would be Daniel 12, in which the righteous will shine like stars, or Ezekiel 37, where the dead are remade from the bones outwards, with God's breath finally animating them. Those should have been the starting points. Those are not the starting points. We don't see Jesus portrayed that way in the gospel stories. We see Jesus portrayed as a real human being, eating, drinking, walking, talking, flesh and blood, touch, here's the deal. But there was also something different about him. He was not the same because he was able to come and go through locked doors. He was able to appear and disappear. And then he was finally able to go into heaven, the realm of God's dimension and reality, and promised his return, right? This was how he was portrayed. And Wright asked the question, what could have generated such stories? The simplest answer is the best. Jesus' followers were not expecting any such thing, and had they wanted at a later date to invent stories about a resurrection, they would not have done it like this. Why would they have not done it like this? Well, because they would have invented their stories related, grounded, founded, drawn from Ezekiel and Daniel. That's what they would have done if they wanted to invent the story later. The story made no sense. And so again, the simplest answer is that they were simply describing what they actually saw, even though it kind of left them dazed and confused. Sometimes the simplest answer is the thing that kind of makes you go, but they could have done it this other way, which would have helped them. It would have helped the cause, so to speak. But they weren't worried about that. They were telling the story. So, finally, to wrap this week up, it is important to think historically about how the early traditions might have developed. So what we're trying to get at here is just this reality that neither the empty tomb alone nor resurrection appearances alone would have, I probably should show you guys this. There we go. It's important to think historically about how the early traditions might have developed. And so what we're trying to get at is this idea that neither the empty tomb alone nor the resurrection appearances alone would have brought about this belief in Jesus's resurrection. Right? This is kind of an important thing to think through. So what if we just had an empty tomb? What if the women showed up and there was just an empty tomb? Let's say there were no post-resurrection appearances. There are a million ways now that you could explain an empty tomb. Now we get into that whole story that the Jewish leadership was promoting about the disciples having stolen Jesus's body. That now becomes plausible because you just have an empty tomb. But we don't just have an empty tomb. We have an empty tomb and we have eyewitness resurrection appearances. Okay, well, what if all we have are eyewitness resurrection appearances? Well, then what do we have? Well, we have the ability to produce a body. We have the ability for the Roman and Jewish authorities to go to the tomb, pull the stone away. Here's the body. You see, you needed both. You needed the both and. You needed the empty tomb, and you needed resurrection appearances. You needed both of these things to make the belief in a resurrection possible, to make it reasonable. to make it generative. And because in any other way, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So the way that Wright and Bird summarize this is they say the belief that Jesus had been bodily raised from the dead emerged necessarily from both the discovery of the empty tomb and the appearances of him alive after his death. The empty tomb and the appearances of a living Jesus, taken together, provide a powerful reason for the emergence of the church's belief in his resurrection. It's what makes sense. It's what makes sense. So these are the 8 presuppositions that we are working with as we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John next week. And we're going to kind of fly through them next in our next episode. But this is the foundation for the origins of Easter in the Gospels. 1, the stories lack scriptural embellishment. 2, the burial of Jesus and the discovery of the empty tomb can be regarded as historically solid. 3, the Easter narratives seem to reflect a mixture of eyewitness enthusiasm and strange bewilderment as to what had actually happened. 4, the wide breadth of people who saw Jesus is also telling. 5, we have to wrestle with the question of why the early Christians said Jesus is risen if all they had intended to describe was a hallucination, a vision, or a vague belief that Jesus had ascended post-mortem into some heavenly, otherworldly realm. 6, a further sign that the Easter stories in the 4 Gospels go back to very early pre-Pauline tradition is the remarkable absence in them of any mention of the Christian future hope. 7, another similar point concerns the portrait of Jesus in the stories. And 8, it is important to think historically about how the early traditions might have developed. So this is where we're heading. Those are our presuppositions. That is the foundation on which this is built. So to that end, ladies, do you have any questions or any thoughts?
I guess I never thought about the fact of the Gospels being written after Paul's letters. I guess I knew that, and I found that very interesting. But how do they know? How do they determine they were written?
Yeah, I mean, this is dating this stuff is really hard. And so part of it goes back to, archaeological work as far as looking at, when do we have scraps? When do we have, what are our earliest, scrolls and papyri and that kind of thing of these documents. Some of it goes to, especially Paul. What's helpful about Paul is he's writing these personal letters, and so we're able to use some of his introductory and conclusion remarks to date them, to place them when he gives us some idea of this. I'm writing during this time and this time, and then some of it comes from tradition, just kind of having an idea of when these letters began, or when these Gospels and letters began to circulate. So we're pretty sure, scholars are pretty sure that the Gospel of Mark was the earliest Gospel, probably around 68 AD, and then Matthew and Luke following after him, probably using Mark as a source. We're probably, they're probably in that mid 70s to early 80s realm, and then the Gospel of John is later, probably more along the 90 to 100 realm, somewhere in there. So those are our best guesses for when these things were written down. Now, the stories circulating came from oral tradition that were being passed around from day one. So yeah. So how it's technical, and it's all this archaeological work and scholarly work that these guys do. But those are the earliest dates. Some folks push them a little bit later, but that's kind of the general assumption on things.
That whole explanation was just fascinating to me. You know, what they would have been after Paul, before Paul as opposed to after.
Right.
And how they, what they didn't include and what they did include. That was just
the part about the women.
Yeah, the part about the women especially. That was very fascinating.
Yeah, it is so interesting. One of the things that I did in seminary was to read through the Gospel of Luke and look for allusions or echoes to Paul's writing. And they're all over the place. You can see Paul's influence in the Gospel of Luke everywhere. It's crazy. If you really want to put some work into it, you can do that. It was a really good exercise for me to kind of see the influence of Paul on Luke. And so for Luke to not necessarily follow the Pauline kind of official storyline or narrative from 1 Corinthians 15 is so interesting to see him diverge from that.
So did all of those writings, all of the letters of Paul then come before the Gospels?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
That's a lot of the New Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's what's also interesting about that then is you have a lot of people who say, well, we need to interpret Paul through the Gospels, which on its face makes sense, right? Because we think, well, yeah, we want to try to understand. We want to understand Paul in light of the stories of Jesus, and yet Paul was written earlier. Paul is getting us closer to that generation, those people most close to Christ. So you kind of have to wonder, like, how. So you really have to wrestle through how do we prioritize some of these texts, and how do we use them to interpret one another and give us insight. So. Any other thoughts?
I thought it was really interesting when you brought up about the women, where some places they were brushed away and other places they were there. I know the women were second-class citizens then, but I'm so glad that was showed that the women were the first one, that they didn't remove that at the tomb. I appreciated that thought.
Yeah, it's important. It's important, and when I think it's so important about it too is that it didn't help their cause, and yet they kept it, and it seems like if you were gonna make something up, you would want to make it up so that it helped your cause,
So were the women the first one to go as kind of the way of God showing that we're equal? And
good
word, but
yeah, I think that is definitely an application we can draw, right? I think it for sure points us. I lost you there for a minute. Yeah, I think it for sure. I think it's an application we can draw, and I think it points us towards an important to that some of those important realities. I don't know if it was necessarily the first order of idea there, right? But I think it points to this very real truth that in Christ, male and female are co-equal. That trajectory within the church was to, at least in the early Christian tradition, is to elevate women far above what the first century secular world was doing, or even the Jewish world was doing at that time. And so there's a clear trajectory that we see in the Gospels, and I think what's interesting about that, especially when we consider the reality of, Paul writing before the Gospels, that there's an elevation of women that we see in the Gospels, particularly Luke, that we don't see quite as necessarily as clearly in Paul. So we see the trajectory, we see the development from Paul into the Gospels, which I think is also interesting. So here we are, maybe 20 years, 15 years removed from Paul's writings, and women, especially in Luke, are being well elevated above even from what we saw in Paul, which Paul's writing, as much as some folks give him guff, we're still super progressive regarding women, in comparison to the rest of his culture, especially Ephesians 5 with the idea of mutual submission, which was that was crazy talk, prior to Paul. So to see the trajectory from even just from Paul into the Gospels is remarkable, and it points to the fact that we should be a lot further along today than we are. So it's one of those areas we need more help with. We need to keep pushing. So anything else?
No.
All right. Well, guys, thank you for being with me. We're grateful y'all have been with us for Beyond Sunday School. Again, want to encourage those of you watching or listening. You can subscribe at danielemrose.com for my semi-daily devotional spiritual insights for the short attention span. Little 5-minute hits each, probably about 3 days a week. And so if you want to subscribe there, you can. But then, as always, Beyond Sunday School, Thursdays, 10 a.m. for the live broadcast, live recording. If you want to be a part of it with us here in the room, we'd love to have you. Just let me know, and I will get you a link to be a part of the live recording. And so until next time, love well, my friends.
Thank you, Dan.